So the next plenary session is Unpacking Lived Experience Leadership. In this session, we'll be discussing the meaning of lived experience within different contexts and in relation to themes, representation, accountability, leadership, and solidarity. Speakers will examine the principles and complexities of meaningful engagement and leadership of people with first-hand experience of a particular issue, as well as the ethical, political, and practical dimensions of doing so. And now I will pass on to the moderator for this session, Mia-lia. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. Hi, everyone. My name is Mia-lia, and I am the Campaigns and Communications Coordinator at the International Detention Coalition. I'm based in Melbourne, and I'm of Laotian, Cambodian, Irish, Australian heritage, and spent most of my life in the United States. So I'm really excited about this conversation and first want to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara people as the First Nations owners of the lands where we now stand. We pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and we acknowledge the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders play in our community, and we're thankful for this space today to have this important conversation. So just a little bit of framing around this conversation. The format of the plenary is that we're breaking it down across themes, which Grace mentioned: representation, accountability, leadership, and solidarity. And as we were planning this session, we felt that those were four important nuggets to dive into deeper in this conversation. And just also to disclose that these are really big conversations, and they're deep, and they hit people in different ways or land in your eyes in different ways. And so if things come up for you that you need to step out, or if there are spaces here in S Block, the spot, as well as another prayer room where people can go if you need a little bit of space. So just a little bit of context around this term, lived experience, which is talked about a lot in the sector. We discussed this as a panel that it's a political term, right? Which was came out in essence to counter the narrative that expertise is academic or legal or policy based, and so lived experience as an expertise is something that was brought out in the sector to say that people with experience of issues have expertise in this advocacy space as well, and that we need to carve out room for that and space for that to lead our work. So just as in terms of contextually, that term is a political term which is meant to challenge the way we do our work. Also just to preliminarily for this discussion, we wanted to just share a few principles, and we think of them just as grounding principles to frame what you're hearing. What we all agree, and we hope that you agree, is that we believe in changing systems, and therefore we don't replicate harms of our current systems, which include marginalization, exclusion, and things like that. We also believe that change happens from the ground up, which means that we need to support and elevate people that are most impacted by the issues. And we believe in change that transforms people and communities and systems, and therefore we need to be really bold, reflective, and brave and honest with each other in our work. So those are just a few kind of grounding frameworks for the conversations that we'll have. So with that, I'm going to turn to the panelists and ask you to introduce yourselves. Who are you? Why is this conversation important to you? And do you have an additional principle or learning that you want people to keep in mind throughout this conversation? Zaki?
My name is... Okay, again. My name is Zaki Haidari. I am recognized refugee by the Australian Immigration from Afghanistan, but I live as an asylum seeker still on a temporary visa, seeking for a permanent home or permanent protection. What brought me to this conference, which I'm very grateful to be here, is I have been involved with the advocacy since I arrived in Australia. The first thing that was shocked me was changing my date of birth to make me older, and then denying being in detention center for a while, and then denying my basic human rights, such as being normal human, having access to education, belong to the community, the Australian community. So that tricked me in a way that I had to stand up and speak and raise the issues that people who are in my situation are suffering. And also we had to sign the code of behavior, which meant that we can't speak publicly on what was going around. It was time that the Australian policy was changed for asylum seekers who were coming to Australia when I arrived. So that was, thank you, that was in 2012. Since then, I have been advocating for asylum seekers. And yeah, that's me. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Dominic Golding. I work... No, I've got a mic here. I work for NIDA, which is the National Ethnic Disability Alliance. We are a DPO, which means we are a disability persons organisation. Our work is mainly to advocate to federal government about cold issues for people with disabilities from migrant and refugee backgrounds. Yes? Yes. I have two disabilities, so I have hearing impairment and cerebral palsy. Actually came to Australia in a very unique set of circumstances. Yo? Yo.
Sure, now you can.
So I'm actually from called a program. Yeah, okay. Going through my hearing aids and all the electronic audio, it's like, yeah, I might as well be on a set of Star Trek. So I actually came to Australia on a program called Operation Baby Lift. So the Australian government airlifted over 300 children out of orphanages to Australia, and on the back of following the US government airlift. So I kind of came out of two orphanages in Vietnam at the 1975. So I actually kind of crossed between the Vietnam War, smack bang before the Vietnamese refugees came by boats. And so I've kind of been in Australia since 75. Most Vietnamese refugees as boat people. Now, I must stress that there were Vietnamese in Australia who came under the Colombo Plan. But for the great popular mythology around migration and Vietnamese refugees, they mainly came from 1978 onwards. So I was in Australia 8 years before most Vietnamese refugees come to Australia. And I'm mainly going to be presenting stuff around race, growing up as a white person, working with white institutions in the disability sector.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Cyprian from Rwandan Association of Queensland. This conference is very important for me because I have been a refugee for more than 25 years, and I crossed many countries before coming to Australia 4 years ago. And today I will share with you the issue of accountability, whereby I will speak on barriers of meaningful participation or engagement of refugees. And also I will talk on the issue of solidarity among peacemakers and stakeholders. Thank you.
Hi, everyone.
I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose land we meet today, the Yagara people in this beautiful country in Mianjin, or as you may know it, Brisbane. I am a Palawa woman, a Tasmanian Aboriginal woman from a beautiful part of the world in Eaglehawk Neck, the southeast pocket of Tassie. It's about 45 minutes out of Nipaluna, or Hobart, as you may know it. We need to decolonise these spaces wherever we can. I work at National Indigenous Television. Hopefully you've heard of us. We're a part of the SBS network. We've been there in a bit of an arranged marriage, so to speak, with SBS for about 7 years. We've existed as a channel since 2007. NITV, we are a really distinct part of the Australian media landscape. Our whole ethos is about being by, for and about Aboriginal Australians, but I think it's more than that. One of the recommendations out of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody in the early 90s was that we need a place for us where we can see ourselves reflected on screens in positive ways, also, without that anthropological lens on our stories, and with us telling our stories. So I run the News and Current Affairs team. We're 30 blackfellas in 5 states, 2 territories, and we're telling stories about our communities every day. I think what really excites me about the conversation we're having today is solidarity as well. And, we make up 3% of the population in Australia. Things aren't going to change in our community without allies. So I think particularly between Indigenous and multicultural Australia, there's a real opportunity for us to work together as outliers. We often sit on the fringes of society, and how can we work together to improve the lives of our people collectively? That's me.
Hi everyone, my name is Shukufa. As you may guess, I also come from a refugee background. Have been in the refugee community, have been part of that ecosystem, and really came into this sector in response to the really harsh laws and policies back in 2013, exactly when Zaki came and his cohort came. And we're still here, we're still trying to actually make improvements to the lives of people seeking asylum, and of course it's deteriorating. But what really brings me to this panel is my work supporting people from refugee backgrounds, people seeking asylum, supporting communities, my own background, and my work with Refugee Council of Australia. With today, I do hope that we can go beyond the conceptual and theoretical frameworks behind lived experiences, how that may apply in policy and political landscapes. I hope that we can actually explore practical tools where we can actually embed the usefulness and purpose in embedding in institutions the capability of actually strengthening themselves and moving away from this reductionist and deficit view that we have with people with lived experience, and how much they can contribute to the institutions and the landscape we have in place right now. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name's Nisha Drago. I left my country of origin when I was 6 and grew up in Southeast Asia. And I came to Australia about 14 years ago now, and I came because I was given the opportunity to study here, and subsequently had the opportunity to work here, and ultimately, after about a decade, to become a citizen here, to find love here, and to develop also an interest in the outdoors. In Australia, the background that I'm from, the outdoors is a very foreign thing, a big city in India. So Australia has given me a lot, but I've also experienced many of the challenges that a lot of people in the room would have experienced coming to Australia as a teenager without family, navigating a new society, and navigating the system, or many systems, rather. And I share this not because, not to solicit empathy or sympathy or to align myself in a particular category of lived experience. I say this because I want to acknowledge for myself and for everyone in the room that we all have lived experience, and there are similarities and there are differences in lived experience. And God knows in this sector we need to build allies. We need to understand the similarities in all of our lived experiences and build on them. So the second point I wanted to make is that I work for the Jesuit Refugee Service, which is a key, dare I say, provider of services to people seeking asylum in Australia. And I manage our advocacy and communications work. And so I also have an interest in unpacking the challenges and the kind of messy reality of organizations not just engaging meaningfully with lived experience, but people with lived experience, but collaborating in an equitable way to achieve impact. And I'm hoping that we can unpack some of that today in this panel.
Great. So as you can see, there's a lot to be said in the next hour or so. So I just also want to share with you all that the format of this also includes that we're not going to open for Q&A. We're just going to keep this a conversation across these themes and to have the panelists sharing with you and with each other. And then there will be space at the end in the spot where all of us will be for more intimate and direct conversation about different topics that rise up for people. Okay, ready? All right, we're going to start with representation. So the first question is to define lived experience in the sector. What does it mean to have lived experience? Who has historically defined it? And who should define lived experience moving forward? So Zaki, I'm going to ask you to start, and then Shukufa and Dominic.
That's a good question. I can't define the lived experience, but what I can do is I can give you a vision of my experience coming to Australia at the age of 17, not knowing anybody, going to detention center, and then coming out to the community with no work right, with no money. So I was struggling. And then also understanding the policies that we have to go through. For example, the code of behavior that we were given, which was we have to sign a contract between us and the Department of Immigration that we wouldn't. It was very complex, and still we don't understand it. So it's basically give you a paper to sign, so they have all the rights that they can. So if you do anything that's not in their advantage, they can take you away and put you in a detention center. So at that age, it was really confusing for me, and I did want to go to school, which was a dream for my family. I was getting up early morning, and I was seeing people in my age were going to school, and I couldn't go to school because I didn't have that right. So I was basically sitting home and did nothing basically till I moved on, and I started doing some volunteer job through which I met people and started doing some advocacy work, and I got a scholarship to learn English and went to college, move on. But the point is, my experience is, since I stepped on shore, all these harsh policies that were introduced are still on place are affecting me on my daily life. For example, I cannot call Australia a permanent home with the current policy forever. So that affects me on my daily life. I can't have a future. I can't vision myself on what I'm going to be in 5 years, right? It takes away my loved one who are in war zone. I can't bring them here. So living in that feeling or experience every day, it's hurting me. And I know people who are away from their really young kids and has been 8 years. that they don't know if they're going to see them one day or not. You know, those policies that are affected are still in place, impacting people like myself on a daily basis, not physically, but mentally. We're in limbo that we don't know how and when this whole limbo will get over. For example, the TP visa or SHAFE visa, which was introduced, we had followed everything, and we still don't know how far we're going to go with this limbo-ness or temporary life. So that's my experience of being an asylum seeker for almost 8 years in Australia, and I still don't know how long I will be still an asylum seeker and living in temporary, which I guess, and I think a lot of people will agree with me, it's a shame for a country like Australia that don't give only a few thousands of people a permanent visa, so then we can call Australia as a home country or a permanent home country. I do still call Australia home because I have been given a lot of opportunity from the community, not from any department, but I can't call it home because of a piece of paper, you know, which make me a citizen. But I do feel morally I'm a citizen, living here for 7 years.
Yeah, thank you, Zaki. I mean, you elaborated what lived experience means, living under a policy every day and feeling it through and through, going through the bumps. And I suppose in defining lived experience, you can't really define it in one formula. It's very different, like you said, for everyone. But I think bureaucratically, professionally, academically, it's really defined in a way where it's really reduced to nothing. It has no value or weight to it when it comes to the academia or the professional settings or the bureaucracy that we have in place. In the context that the term lived experience, we're coining it up right now is actually adding a value and weight to it as an expertise. Because lived experience on its own accord is one thing, but the wisdom that comes from it is another thing. And you know, you would see that former refugees, like myself, like some of us here in this conference, you know, why we're relevant in ascertaining policy or setting priorities is because we do hold that wisdom. We have been through that experience, and even though it's not a live thing for us, we do hold that wisdom, and that we live in that ecosystem. We live with communities who go through these things every day, and that there is a lot of importance attached to that. And why we're prioritizing on this term in this conference is actually to move beyond, you know, the shock value that the supposed lived experience is meant to invoke. Like I said, there is, you know, different thresholds to lived experience, and really traditionally, when we talk about people's experiences, we expect to be shocked, we expect to be entertained, we expect to actually have a cognitive response to people's lived experiences. But that's not how it should be. That's not the only value. I think it's pretty patronizing to attach value to only the horror and the chaos that's attached to people's stories. There's more, there's expertise. And that's how I see lived experience as expertise. Yeah, so, and I suppose that's where we have to take the conversation, is that how do we utilize this expertise in the policy and political landscape through a very purposeful method, and practically doing that. I think we'll go through really different themes to explore how we can actually utilize lived experience.
I'm going to come in with a slightly different lens here. I'm going to give you a bit back. Ew. I'm going to give you basically a 101 history lesson. So bear with me for a moment. How many minutes? 5 minutes. A history lesson in 5 minutes, right. So basically, you got the disability rights movement, and you got the migration rights movement, which eventually came out with called multiculturalism. They both started around the same time, back in the 60s and 70s. So the refugee movement was about migration, post-war migrants getting their rights out of assimilation. Because the Australian government at the time, after post-war, demanded that all migrants become as white as possible. You lose your language, you lose your culture, and blah, blah, blah. So, on the disability side of things, you have people with disabilities who are being incarcerated in institutions, in care facilities, in asylums, and so forth. Because we're dealing with a Darwinism and 1800s idea of what is the body, what is the mind. So the disability movement was about getting people out of institutions into the community, and so that the community can better understand and work and provide support for people with disabilities. Now, what was really ironic is that these two movements are based on people's lived experience. That was actually under the guise of what various different governments had decided is in the best interest of people with disability and in what's in the best interest for migrants, which actually translates to being the best interest of white Australia. So, and we also got the thing with that is that disability movement, how to get support from government, was actually initiated by First World War II veterans coming back after the Great War. And World War II veterans because they demanded more support for their impairments. Now, then we got the conflict that kind of came out of, which is the Vietnam War. And there where we enter into the discourse around mental health and psychosocial disability, which is essentially PTSD. Now, what we need you to do is try and work out how do you collate both of those two movements today between the disability sector and the migration sector so that everyone gets equal access to support, health and otherwise. So that's where yeah.
Great.
Thanks, Dominic. So the second question inside of representation is, why is representation of lived experience important, and how have you seen inclusion impact work in the sector? And I'll start with Rhanna and then Nish, if you have more.
Yeah, I mean, representation, this is what we do every day in the media industry, in the business of news and current affairs, which is sort of my bread and butter. It's absolutely crucial. We're giving Australians and the world an entry point to understand the diversity of experiences and perspectives with an authenticity of voice. It's such a unique proposition in the marketplace to get a window into our world, our experiences, who we are, our triumphs, our obstacles and challenges. And I think it's even bigger than that, because bad public perception leads to bad public policy. So the way, I spoke briefly in my introduction about, mainstream media has historically talked about us anthropologically, but not only that, they've even, yesterday with the Closing the Gap report announcement and addressed by the Prime Minister, we just put in a deficit discourse, and we're so much more than that. And I think that's something that's felt right across, the range of communities in Australia. How we're spoken about can be so damaging. So the Closing the Gap report yesterday, obviously we're meeting 2 out of the 7 targets, and to put us to use that kind of language, with child mortality rates, being, we have the worst, we've got the highest suicide stats, we're the most incarcerated. It's just, how can we move from there? If the Australian government was a business and millions of dollars were sunk for 12 years into a project and it kept failing, you'd be going into receivership at least. So I think it's so important the way that our stories are told, and to give people an avenue to understand who we are and the complexity of our lives. And the only way to do that is, if you don't know an Aboriginal person, is to educate yourself and use channels like NITV that have that authenticity and primacy of voice to understand who we are.
Yeah, so let me come at this from a advocacy and, I guess, policy perspective from within the refugee sector. The question of representation of lived experience in the spaces that we work in, I think where a platform is provided for individuals and the communities, cohorts, groups of people that they perhaps represent to not just articulate their stories, but articulate the impacts of policy on them and their communities, articulate what they want to see. When that is brought into the room or at the table, that knowledge, it can shift the focus of a policy and advocacy discussion. And too often in the sector, we're thinking in terms of strategy. We're thinking in terms of the politics of the achievable, government frames and the like. And so when you bring that different knowledge and expertise into the room, you set up a dialogue between those two different kinds of thinking. And hopefully, there's a level of trust and equal footing that allows those two perspectives to negotiate and come up with something that can achieve an impact for people affected. The question of whether inclusion's an interesting term. I'll default that by saying a seat at the table. Has that achieved impact? Well, I don't know, but I think we need to go beyond inclusion and ultimately be, as sector professionals, so to speak, be engaged rather than be engaging people with lived experience or groups with lived experience. So, the ideal world, hopefully, is an organization like JRS that has 40 years of experience in this in this space is called upon at particular moments where the people who have experienced forced displacement say to JRS, well, we recognize that your expertise is X, Y, and Z, and we want your input on this. And that's a change in power. That's a change in the dynamics of a sector like ours. Don't know how we get there, but yeah.
Great. Thanks. Big topics, big. Yeah. So the next thing we want to talk about is accountability. And what does meaningful engagement of communities look like? What are the key elements and what are the barriers? We'll start with you, Cyprian, and then Zaki and Dominic.
Thank you. When we talk about accountability, we talk about an approach which involves people to participate actively. So, in this case, for refugees, let me start by this quotation. East or West, home is the best. In Latin America, they have a good expression. Pachamama, Tierra Madre, motherland. So for refugees, is someone who has left, who has forced to leave his mother. In Kinyarwanda, we have a proverb saying that what you lose and you can never see it is your mother. This is how a refugee is. He has left everything and he is now in another country. a new country mean? New people, new culture, new language, everything. So, in my case, for example, I left my country, and when I arrived to Kenya, I have to learn another language. I have to learn Swahili for survival. I have to learn English for education. After, you have to learn Spanish to go for my education. You know, so those are among the barriers of meaningful participation, meaningful involvement. Cultural barriers are there. Language barriers are there. Economical barriers are there. Social barriers are there. How? You have left the friends, you are in a new world. You don't have social capital. You are isolated. So, in order to participate, to meaningfully be seen in the society, you need a network. You need to be involved. And I think participation is a better pathway to the real integration. In this case, like here in Australia, as my friend Zak has said, even though he's Australian, but is a paper, yes, but he still have nostalgia of his country. He still have that lack of belongings. So now, how the policymakers, NGOs, I mean the government on the top, can involve meaningfully, can include these people, these minority people, in the area whereby they can feel that belonging, whereby they can feel the participation. Thank you.
The only thing that I can take from that is the barrier. As I mentioned before, when we arrived to Australia, or since 2012, a lot of policy were introduced. A lot of money or spent. A lot of media attention went on just to label as a border arrival or illegal arrival, right? So the government intentionally created that barrier between the local community or Australian community and asylum seeker. So where we were a devil, like we're flying in, we're harm to the community, we are getting Centrelink, which we don't deserve, but then we didn't have work right for 3 years. We were forced to get Centrelink. We didn't have access to education to learn the language, which is the main important stuff to get involved or get engaged with community. You need that language skill, which we didn't have it for 3 years until we started a table talk to get TAFE involved in New South Wales and to offer English classes for asylum seeker. So these barrier tools were created from very powerful authorities in the community, and we were the victim. You know, we didn't have anything to go on and to reduce that barrier. There were small talks on media or through community or through NGOs, but if you put in perspective the whole Australia, it was a huge campaign against us. In the bigger city, it was easier because, as Rhanna was saying, you can meet people, right? You meet people if they're from refugee background. You can relate to them because we're all human. We have that sense of humanity. We all have brothers. We all have sisters or families. We can share our experience, and they can relate to you. That's how you get involved or engage. But, for example, in rural Australia, how are they going to know if they only probably listen to what campaign is going on, for illegal people or boat arrivals, right? They wouldn't have that many opportunities as someone who's living in big cities to meet refugees. So the barrier was created and it's still going on. How we can remove that, it's a question on how much resources we can put in. You know, how can we get the dialogue out of introducing these both people as a normal human, a people who have feelings, who love to work, who love to learn the language, who has family, you know, just normal human. We need those resources. I don't know how, but if we do have that, we will get to a point.
I think that one of the two key words that pop up, one is integration, the other word is participation. But what do they actually mean and for who? Who is integrated into what? How much are you participating to doing exactly what? And why are you participating? The thing, I'm going to talk about what's essentially called white supremacy, which is an academic term about how our systems are based on the idea that the white people should own everything. They should own functions of the economy. They should own functions of land, territory, waters, and so forth. But they also own functions of social civil society. See, what's really interesting is that even though both the immigration and post-war migrants, the Greeks, the Italians, the Northern Europeans, advocated for the multiculturalism, I'm going to say a very strictly, very controversial statement now. It was because they wanted to maintain degrees of whiteness to Anglo-Saxon Australians. Hence, further on down the case is that migration policy really is not for the benefit of darker brown people or yellow people. Vietnamese came into Australia on the borderline of the White Australia policy in 1975. Now, just to shift the lens a little bit, in disability sector, disabled bodies, unthinking bodies, women, because women were seen as hysteria, couldn't handle their menopause, and all sorts of things were medicalised on the basis of they need to be fixed, or they need to be held away and not seen, because we must maintain the lens that white Australia is a fit, able-bodied, working, male Australian society. But it doesn't, you see, multiculturalism today and the NDIS is an evolution from both of those policies. They haven't actually fundamentally made changes around integration and participation. So multiculturalism today is about lovely festivities, get dressed up in your ethnic clothing, we can all clap hands and all, oh, that's so very good. But the other thing is the NDIS, the disability, as great as a public reform it is since Medicare, as the government likes to say, NDIS is principally based on the idea that the market will fix my body. The market will make sure that I'm integrated into society. The market is meant to make sure that I have the funds to pay you to participate in society. But is that a genuine agency, as me, the person with disabilities from a cold background? It has to a point. I can buy aids, I can get physiotherapy, I can get all sorts of supports, but it doesn't address the fundamental power difference of white Australian white supremacy that is actually overall is ensuring that both migrant and cold people and people with disabilities are managed. So what is even, just to clarify, what's even problematic is that the from my work, working with refugees with disabilities and migrants with disabilities, is that the disability sector, as I said before earlier, came out of a process of deinstitutionalisation. It was still based on essentially white Australians with disabilities advocating for their needs, and that they should be seen as being part of the Australian society and to be able to integrate and participate in Australian society. But the problem is that the 99% of the disability sector is dominated by white people. 85% of the disability sector is dominated by white carers or people who, to put it in a polite term, my son has a disability, I know what it's like to be disabled. That doesn't actually change the power dynamic of what the NDIS is supposed to do, and there is no communication between the disability sector and the immigration sector, which is why refugees with disability and cold people with disability are still falling through the gap because they're not noted and not recognised by both the immigration, and they're not noticed by mainstream healthcare service providers. Thank you.
Thanks, Dominic. So following on from the conversation about barriers in accountability, I'd like to ask Shukufa and Rhanna to speak about how organizations can change their structures, processes, and beliefs in order for this meaningful engagement, participation, however you want to frame it, can take place.
Well, thank you all. How do I follow after Dom? Dom's critique is just amazing. Yeah, I think I heard a lot of similar terms. Dom said, we don't want to be managed. But I think that rings a lot of bells in my ears, is that we have dealt with refugees and people seeking asylum and, other marginalized groups within refugee community as though they are just clients, as though they are the only beneficiaries to be managed case by case basis. And I think that is absolutely the approach that we have to change. We have to externalize that approach and go out to the community. And Zaki spoke, when he speaks, he says, not I as an asylum seekers, but we, because they are a collective group, they have collective identity, they face collective, effect of the policies, they are collectively subjected to the same consequences and repercussions of these really difficult policies. And I heard social capital from, I couldn't quite pronounce your name, I'm so embarrassed. Cyprian. Social capital. This all really leads me to one thing, and that is there has to be an approach where it goes beyond the organizational approach. It cannot be confined to individuals. We can't actually tick the box of engaging in our processes refugees or actually empowering refugee voices through just only visible media opportunities. Sometimes it's actually almost patronizing to just include them in visible public spaces. I have actually seen spaces and where that particular person from refugee background is not really equipped to be there. They're put in a position, say, of very highly academic setting and expect to, moderate a session or understand what the academics are saying. I mean, that, ends up looking very patronizing. It really actually puts off those platforms from actually including people with lived experience. It really dwindles down the platforms that they have access to. I think it doesn't really do justice, this visible kind of, public spaces and inclusion of people with lived experience. And the other point I was going to say is that while communities are collective, they have really, collective loss, collective background. A lot of these refugee communities actually come from minority groups that have been persecuted in their home countries. And so they act collectively. They have infrastructures inside their communities. It takes a bit of research to find out that there are invisible structures that are very, very effective, but are taken lightly because they're not seen as valuable of a structure as, say, an organization trying to manage them is seen. And I think that really goes back to actually not trusting their capability to manage themselves. I think taking away agency is seen as an essential thing to manage them properly, manage them in a way that, Dom, you touched best on, manage them in a way that system dictates them to. And I think that's very harmful. So what can change practically is for organizations to actually get to know communities individually. Refugee communities are not uniform communities. They are very complex, very different, and there are hundreds of different communities with different customs and different ways of organizing. And so going to, it's a huge task, but that's the nature of this task, is that if you want to do a meaningful engagement work, is that you have to do the homework. You have to do the messy work. You have to actually fall down and get back again, and then find, a way to go forward. There is no one solution. There are many actually methods of actually engaging with communities. And it's about actually then going to communities, treating them as equal partners, not as your subjects. Partnering with communities not just on storytelling projects, but actually your research project, or a service design consultation, or things that they have a lot of stake at because they're affected directly by those. And then when it comes to the institution, I think that sometimes we do pride ourselves, organizations pride themselves on, employing a certain quota of people from refugee backgrounds. It's great. But if you actually dig a little bit deeper, you'd have to actually analyze what kind of roles they're assigned to. It's very easy to assign someone from refugee background to a community engagement role. But what about the institution? Does that change the institution? Is the institution more accommodating to refugees than before? Or is it actually creating a shortcut, a bridge to get to them? It's not changing institutions. It's not shifting the attitudes within the institutions at senior levels. It's not really changing anything. I think that we are just, deceiving ourselves. And so I think at every level, the institution, at managerial level, at more senior level, they have to be able to actually engage with communities directly. It should not be an inconvenient task. Institutions should be trained to do that. It takes time, but it's possible.
I completely agree. This conversation is getting really exciting. So we need systemic change in all public and private sectors, I think, is what we're in agreement of, and that's across all systems. I mean, I really thought Dom's last point was really interesting because, our country doesn't have a great track record of dealing with our history, and I think that's a experience that's reflected in many people. Many people in this room may feel the same way. So until our country really faces the history of policies that have impacted the lives of migrant and Indigenous communities, how can we have systemic change across the board? I guess that's the main point that I would like to leave on. Yeah.
If I had to make a really, really brief point on that is actually, we as a sector, we have the obligation to actually go out to communities and strengthen their structures. If they need resource, we have to find ways to find them resource so they can operate in a way where they can actually come on the surface and become a little bit more visible and be taken a bit seriously by, the departments or stakeholders that deal with them. That we have to actively go out into the community and, in Nishad's word, not be engaging, but be engaged with them.
Just to add, and taking this back again to JRS. JRS is a charity, right? And JRS has been a charity for a long time, since its inception. And that has a particular history, it has a particular style of engagement, and it has particular assumptions about the people that we are engaging, right? So we ask people, how can we help you, not how can we work together? If you're unable or unwilling or inadvertently cannot even see the agency and the full humanity of the people that you're engaging, then you cannot even begin to ask, how can we work together? And I think in the Australian context anyway, there is something of a codependency between NGOs and the government. And when I say codependency, I mean the government creates categories that follow its own logics, categories of people. It ascribes moral value to those categories, particularly in Australia. And then we have all of these service regimes and policy regimes that correlate to each particular category. So if you're a refugee who's come via the humanitarian settlement program, you get X entitlements and rights. If you're a person seeking asylum who's arrived by boat, you get, well, not much. If you're a person, so these are constructed categories. They don't necessarily correlate to the lived experience of individuals or communities. And we as NGOs, we get caught up in that in a number of ways, right? Funding structures, contracts, all kinds of things. And in the Australian context, at least since I have worked in this space or volunteered in this space, that has meant that organizations like JRS have defaulted towards charity, towards providing food, towards providing shelter, etc. Now, I'm not saying that's not necessary. It is absolutely necessary given the circumstances. But it prevents us as an organization from being able to not just think about how we can do things differently, but because, in particular, the funding environments, from being able to actually action collaboration in different ways, or action engagement in different ways, towards a more collaborative approach. So, I mean, just to give a very quick example, as of last week, there were 50 people that came to JRS that we weren't even able to see, and they were looking for food and they were looking for a bed for the night. Right? People seeking asylum. And so when you're in that setting, you're wondering, well, okay, I've got a limited amount of money. How do I ethically and practically deal with the people at my door, but also then find the time, the space, the resources, the innovative lateral thinking, et cetera, the partnerships, to be able to look at them as individuals with agents, to understand what communities they're part of, to help them perhaps build capacity, to learn from them, all of that stuff. So it's a complete shit show, isn't it? Like, it's just, and like I say this being someone who is literally in the thick of it, And so anyway, this could go anywhere. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Nishadh. Okay. So now that we've talked some about the barriers to engagement or participation or leadership, and also some of the ways that our systems and structures and organizations need to change, let's talk about what that leadership looks like. So what does community leadership look like? What are the key elements of it? And also, what are the structures and processes that need to happen in order for community leadership to be powerful? And I'm going to open that up to any of you guys.
I'll start it off because it's something that I've observed, having spent 17 years in the refugee migration sector, is how cultures of work and leadership change over time. And my main concern today is that we've got a real, because of management and hiring practices, are really still skewed towards upholding white supremacy. So what I'm trying to mean by that is that we've got this real culture around with NGOs, charities, and service providers who maintain the old Victorian care idea of what it is to be good. What is it to be good? I'm asking you all. Is it good just to hand out cans of baked beans for someone who's homeless and they're waiting for the next Centrelink check? Is that what it is to be good? Is it good for a CEO of a major bank to sleep one night, sleep rough, and say, yes, I'm supporting and getting fundraising money for those who are homeless? Because that doesn't stem from CEOs. We have a real culture of how the marriage between the churches, with the Anglican Church, the Catholic Church, and all the other church groups. Now, I'm agnostic, so I can't really speak on behalf of those who are Hindu or Buddhist or other faith denominations. But growing up as Baptist in an adoptive family, what is being good is how to place my brown body and my disabled body. So, in a way, what we see here in our greater society is how these sectors, the care sector, the hospital sector, the medical sector, the charity sector, the not-for-profit sector, is all still buying into the relationship that they need to hire in a skilled, middle-class white person. Their lived experience is of being good. It is not about empowering vulnerable populations to be able to be in the forefront and designing policy and support services that will ultimately benefit everyone. So we've got technocrats, lobbyists, managers, all who are based on the idea or schooled from the idea of this great institution called the university, on how to do business, how to manage people, and how to actually get the best KPI output of society, of that company. And we need to fundamentally change what that means.
Wow, that's hard to follow. I would have a different approach to that. For me, leadership means empowerment of people with lived experience. I think the issue is very big. And as I did mention before, we have to broadcast it in many ways that we can do it. So which means that if we can provide a platform, by we means organization or expert in the sector, if we can provide that platform to empower refugees and asylum seekers to broadcast the issues and what they are going through and how the policies are in place and how it's affecting them on daily life. So I guess that's how we can develop a leadership where we can bring people with lived experience together and lead them with us as an NGO or organization. It's just a matter of empowering them, informing them of their rights. For example, as we discussed this before, a lot of asylum seekers and refugees, they are not aware of their rights on what they can do and what they cannot do in terms of the policies and how it's going to affect their visa application and ongoing living in Australia. So I guess if we can have that platform where we can educate them about their rights and about the work that needs to be done and how it's going to affect them and people who are living in that situation, we can have great leaders, and I guess we can go out to the community and we will have a huge platform to sort of raise or educate the communities about the issues and about the policies that are in place for asylum seekers and refugees in the community.
Well, taking that from Zaki, I would like to just point out a few practical challenges that face people with lived experience who are future leaders. And I think that sometimes in the sector we do make the mistake of actually putting people with lived experience on pedestal, treating them like it's one thing to respect their lived experiences and actually seeing that as a source of authority when it comes to decision making, but it's quite another to actually depend entirely on someone's lived experience to actually put them on a pedestal where you cannot question anything that they might have to offer or critique what they might have to offer. I think that there has to be a combination of merits, a combination of value, and complemented with lived experience that will be useful in making sure that people with lived experience who are actually leading the conversation and discussions and really visible leadership platforms, that they do actually have this element to make sure that we are, I think with capacity building has become a little bit of a taboo phrase, but actually making sure that they are resourced enough to do it. Of simple things like, are they able to travel? Do they have the cost? Do they have an accommodation if things happen in Canberra? Are they able to do this more than one time? How long is this going to last? We have to look at longevity. We have to look at sustainability side of it. We can't actually, only accept symbolic lived experience leadership. And I think that has been widespread. That has been the case for a very long time. If we are really authentic and genuine about building lived experience leadership, we have to put a lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of listening, a lot of reflection to be able to pull that off. Because it's not like, people with lived experience have infinite amount of time. These are people who struggle the most with life. These are people who struggle the most with the multiple commitments that they have on their shoulders. And on the side of that, to be able to pull off and perform to an extent where they are making change on top of everything else, impossible to be able to make a delivery like that. So they have to be actually resourced enough. They have to be there for a long time so that they develop the expertise, policy expertise, academic expertise, or whatever is required to survive in the ecosystem. And coupled with, armed with lived experience, I think they could be very authoritative individuals. On the other hand, though, what could go wrong with empowering only few individuals is that they can become really problematic gateholders for, that would actually undermine growth of other potential leaders with lived experience. And these are the type of leaders that are not transformative. These are your typical leaders that like to take the seat, and that it's, we're not denying it's really predominant in refugee communities because they do come from spaces where there have been extreme struggles of power and systems of power in place, and so holding on to power gives them some sense of self and identity. And I'm not in any way justifying this, but if it becomes really chronic, it's a problem. It's a problem for communities, and it's a problem for the sector. It's a problem for at a policy level. And I think that we need to make sure that lived experience is also coupled with, very in-depth connection with community members who are, in effect, affected by policies. Lived experience alone cannot be enough to put you in a leadership position. And that leadership I'm talking about is at all levels, behind the scenes, at tables, visibly in public, media. And so there's a lot of homework for us to bring in transformative leadership, but I think that we are capable when we sit down and actually, point out practical challenges that faces lived experience leadership.
Yeah, just to add one more point to that, I think sometimes we, in the professional sector again, tend to default towards bringing people in, bringing leaders we have identified into the spaces and the halls of power that we are most familiar with, in line with the assumptions we make about change. And a challenge with that, going back to your point, is that you end up at times bringing in individuals and you don't really delve into or even attempt to understand the communities that they identify with, the representational power that they have, the cultural aspects of power and leadership within those communities, and think about your relationship or our relationship as a professional sector to that. And we also try to mold leaders in images that we know. The strong, loud personality that can directly take it to the fore to a government official. It's just an example, but and perhaps a stereotype. But I think there's a lot of work to be done to understand what leadership means in other cultural contexts and how individual leadership relates to communities and what representation looks like and where we as a sector fit within all of that, if we fit there at all. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, what I would like to add is that leadership in our community context is situational. I don't think there is a better or worse leadership in the refugee community. Here I would like to mean that bottom up can be better, but we depend with the situation. Up and down sometimes work. In our community, for example, the issue of leadership creates many problems. No one wants to raise his hand to lead the others. They have fear, even though they have skills. But depending on the background of their journey, we found that problem. So, in conclusion, I think is a process. Depending on the situation, those people, especially the refugee community, need civic education, which can come gradually, depending on the situation. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I definitely agree. I think one interesting thing about leadership is how do we make it work in different spaces. So from a community perspective, leadership in the community where I come from is a very different thing to within a business or within an institution. So we need to learn how to walk in two worlds, or that's what we're told. But how can businesses, institutions, governments take leadership, and knowing that it's going to take a long time for systematic change within institutions and government, what can individuals do to take some agency and show leadership in the meantime? I think that's something I'd just like to leave that on.
Thanks so much, everyone. This is awesome. So we've talked about representation, accountability, and leadership. And we're going to close the session. We have about 10 minutes left talking about solidarity. So I'd like to ask all the panelists to talk about what does solidarity look like for you? What are the key elements of it? What's the significance of it? And I think we'll just go down the line.
Okay. And maybe this is my personal perspective. I think that the word solidarity can sometimes be seen as synonymous with having sympathy or empathy for people and communities with lived experience, and not much else. With the proviso that sympathy and empathy then leads us to become engaged in different ways, volunteers, or we work, or we. And my contention would be that perhaps citizens have. What does solidarity mean in the context of citizenship or in the context of Australian citizens engaging on refugee issues and refugee policy in a place like Australia. And I think it goes beyond the question of saying a volunteer or a worker has empathy for or sympathy for refugees and is therefore involved in. People actually have a responsibility and a stake by virtue of being citizens in a democratic society to be involved in change in this issue area. And some people do and some people don't. But for me, that is something different to solidarity. And related to that, I think when we talk about allyship and different kinds of allies, there are examples, and one would be the doctor's peak body in the offshore campaigns. Getting involved not on the basis that they felt sorry for refugees or because they thought something was an injustice, but also because within their own profession and within their own rationales of their profession, they found something that said, well, we have a responsibility to be involved. So when we're talking about centering lived experience and the relationship between people with lived experience, communities with lived experience, and the sector or other allies, I think it's important to mention that we shouldn't relegate people who do not have lived experience or groups who do not have lived experience to the point where they're mere bystanders and they're and I'm not saying this necessarily happens, but I think there's a perception in some quarters that it does, that they feel like, oh, well, okay, we'll get engaged in a certain way when we're told to. I go back to the point about dialogue and understanding where you fit in an ecosystem and respecting people and the institutions you're dealing with fundamentally, and seeing where that goes. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, you unpacked it really nicely, I think, and I don't have a lot to say. But I think that with solidarity comes a lot of responsibility, in that while we stand in solidarity with any cohort of people, we are also accountable in how we execute that solidarity or allyship. And I suppose I like allyship more than the term solidarity, because solidarity can be really vague, and actually trying to design a formula for solidarity can be a bit difficult. Allyship is when you actually do things with them. It's more so collaboration with them, being informed by them. And I think that the epicenter of this is agency, is that you do allyship, we need to do allyship and solidarity where we don't lose basically the subject's agency, that it is really informed by them. And I can give you an example, and I hope that this is not taken as offense by the allies. Is that in some of the protests I noticed when I just actually started noticing the human rights trend in the asylum area back in the days, is in some rallies. I mean, I would join the rallies and to get a taste of really what it is like to be in that platform. But I would see, and they would invite the Hazara Afghan community to be there. But the whole rally were dominated by red flags and socialist alliance messages. And there is absolutely no objection for me. It's not ideological objection that I have or anything of that nature. But just for someone who's come from Afghanistan, who have endured the communist regime, who have lost families to communism and the Russians who came in back in the days, I would imagine that it would be extremely traumatic to be in that space, extremely uncomfortable to be in that space. So therefore, good intentions is not equivalent to good advocacy. Good intentions is not equivalent to good allyship or solidarity. We're absolutely sure that everybody's here in good faith, doing good faith. But I ask you one thing, to do with their agency. If there is a rally, the framing has to be designed by people who are being the subject of these rallies. Otherwise, we're actually deteriorating the situation, not improving it.
Solidarity. I also really prefer the word allyship or allies. I think for Aboriginal communities, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in Australia, it's imperative that we have allies because our situation in this country isn't changing and hasn't changed for quite a bit of time now. And so having allies is central to improving the lives of our people. And that is at every level. That's through policy, you know, the Groundswell People Movement of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Within 2 years, the Prime Minister has a roadmap towards constitutional recognition of Aboriginal people. How can the 97% of non-Indigenous Australians vote on that without being educated? So I think allyship also comes with responsibility. Responsibility to understand the communities that you're allied with, to understand their complexities, their challenges, and there are many, many ways in which to do that in an authentic way, alongside that community. And I think what pleases me the most is having conversations like this and having spaces where we are coming together, and how much that has changed even in the last 5 years, and also seeing that reflected across the media. Not always, but I do think that things have improved in the last 5 years, more so than in the 50 before that. And I'll leave it at that. If anybody wants to have a chat to me after about how to be a good Indigenous ally, I'm more than happy to do that. But I'm not going to sit here and tick off a list. It's a little bit more complicated than that.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, solidarity for me, it means working together toward sustainable development. It came from a French word, solid, which means strong, meaning in our community, if we are together, we can achieve a sustainable goal. Here now, there is one question. Refugee community and peacemakers. How those people, how those sectors, those categories can work together toward a common goal. I would like to emphasize two things: working together and working for and working with. What we can see in a refugee environment is that they are the people who are the peacemakers, the decision makers, who work for refugees. But it's very rare to find organization or a government institution which can work with. And I think those things, if there is something to change, that is something very important. And also the issue of bureaucracy is something which is a barrier to the solidarity we are talking about. Because we have those who knows, not us, we are not teaching you, but we find on the top those the people who knows and those who don't know anything and who need help. And I think if that cooperation can be emphasized, and those refugees or asylum seekers can have also the voice, things can work very good. Thank you.
I'm a guy from the bush, and solidarity is pretty much an alien term for us, actually. I've grown up to be a working class rural white boy. And all the messages that I get growing up about Indigenous people, about refugees, about asylum seekers, is one of othering. So then I come into the sector with, working with. I actually wanted to work as a, growing up as a an Asian boy in white Australia. I actually wanted to know what it's like to be, how do I work with my Vietnamese Australian cohort. So I moved to Melbourne and I joined the Vietnamese youth media. And I realised, well, I ended up trying to do a lot of the hard work about learning about Vietnamese culture, religion, how they operate, what they think in a sense of the social hierarchy, how they look at the world, particularly as Vietnamese were mostly, who had the power, were mainly those from the former South Vietnamese regime, and they had re-established their power base in Australia. And I always get this common question that kept on coming up to me was, you must speak Vietnamese. You're Vietnamese, you must speak Vietnamese. And I'm thinking, well, that's all very well and good, but you don't understand where I'm coming from. So I'm trying to make an effort here. And so I think a lot of the stuff around solidarity and the Recognise campaign, particularly I'm gonna have a go at one particular organisation, and you may not like it. But Multicultural Arts Victoria is a typical migrant arts organisation which has been infiltrated. I'll say they've had infiltration by middle-class white managers. And they like the idea of reconcile, they love the idea of solidarity, they love the idea that, I kid you not, they actually got some young refugee artists to, why don't you put in some Indigenous patterns into your artwork, and you can say how much you actually, acknowledge the first peoples of Australia. And I'm just sitting there going, dude, you can't just implement a dot painting into your oil painting without understanding the cultural significance. So, I actually come to the basis where solidarity is actually, for me, is about class. It's about relationships. I'm growing up with great friends who are Indigenous, refugee background, and also Aussie. But we all come from a basis of respect for one another, as each other, as ourselves, for who we are. So, in other words, if you pick a fight with us, we're just going to bash you up. It doesn't matter what background you are. So, it's kind of like, we've got to do that not just at the pool table, at the bar, but we also have to do that with government, we have to do that with policy makers, and then that sort of thing. So that's where I see solidarity and respect.
Well, that's a lot again. For me, solidarity means different because I was unwelcome to Australia. I was rejected by the immigration and by the authorities. Not just me, the cohort of people that came after 2012 when the policy was changed. So every day in detention center, we were told that they were going to deport us to Nauru or Manus Island or where we came from. Or even when we were given bridging visas in the community, we were advised that it's not a permanent visa. It doesn't mean that you live in Australia permanently, so don't call Australia home. You will be sent to Nauru or Manus Island when we have more room available there, because back then a lot of people came and they were apparently full with the accommodation and stuff like that. So we were totally unwelcomed by the authorities. But what kept us going was people on the street standing with or for us, saying, "You're welcome here." That's the time that we felt welcome, at least from the Australian community. So that's how it means to us that there are people in the community who are standing with us, no matter what immigration is saying, but there are people who are welcoming us and standing with us, fighting for us, or with us, depends on how you define the terminology. So I'm going to end this with, every time you go on the street for the rights of an asylum seeker or refugee, remember this, that every step that you take on the street has an effect or an impact on people who are waiting for their claim to be processed or waiting for their citizenship to process to become an Australian citizen. So I'm saying thank you for everyone who is going on and standing or working with refugees on every rallies across Australia and fighting for their rights. So that's what it means to my cohort of people.
Thank you all so much. I think that what happened here in the last 90 minutes is massive. I think we could have easily had a conference about each one of those themes. And I just thank you for your energy that you put into this space today and everything that you gave, because I know it's a lot. And thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. And we're all going to actually just be outside the room. The S spot isn't available for more discussion at the moment, so we'll just be outside. But please, big round of applause.
Thank you all. And Mia-lia, you're very right in saying every one of these perspectives shared today could have been a whole conference of its own. I don't know about you, but I'm overwhelmed in a good way with so much information and so many different perspectives. And I'd just once again like to thank the panel speakers and Mia-lia for moderating such an amazing session. Thank you.